death knell for U.S. democracy. America is facing a triple crisis: a public health catastrophe, an economic collapse, and a reckoning with racial injustice and inequality.
We have a president who is not only incapable of addressing these crises, but is leading us down the path of authoritarianism. This election is the most important in the modern history of this country. In response to the unprecedented crises we face, we need an unprecedented response, a movement like never before, of people who are prepared to stand up and fight for democracy.
President Trump has spent much of his first term in office trying to turn the power of the state to his own purposes. He has exploited his control over the U.S. government to punish political enemies and reward and protect those who cover up for him. With elections approaching, the authoritarian threshold has now been crossed. Democracy and the rule of law are a thing of the past. During this pandemic, when many Americans will have no choice but to vote by mail, Trump is doing all he can to hamstring the very agency that can make this possible: the U.S. Postal Service. Trump falsely claims that mail-in voting is riddled by fraud. He's blocked additional funding for the post office and admitted he's done this to make it harder to vote by mail.
Now, they need that money in order to have the post office work so it can take all of these millions and millions of ballots. But if they don't get those two items, that means you can't have universal mail-in voting because they're not equipped to have it.
Trump's bizarre comments lend evidence for critics who accuse the president of deliberately sabotaging the Postal Service to boost his re-election chances. Trump is under fire for trying to deprive Americans of their fundamental right to vote during the COVID-19 crisis.
I happen to think, as you know, that Trump is a pathological liar. He lies all of the time. But I got to admit that the other day he was very honest. He said, look, we want to kill mail-in balloting. We don't want millions and millions of people to be able to cast their ballots through the mail. So we'll destroy the Postal Service, we'll defund it, they can't vote.
Is Trump trying to sow dysfunction in the mail system to win the election?
The Republican Party has been trying to reduce voting by Democrats, especially low-income Democrats and minorities, by getting the Republican states, which control the voting in our country, the states control the voting, to reduce the number of voting stations and the number of voting machines in minority neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods. So the Democrats responded by saying, okay, well, vote by mail then, because that way you don't have to worry about long lines at voting stations where you have to vote. But then by attacking the reliability of the mail, Trump is trying to say, well, you better not do that either because your mail may not get delivered on time, your mailed-in vote.
Efforts to sabotage the post office have been underway for months now. In June, Trump replaced the head of the Postal Service with a mega donor with no prior experience. Louis DeJoy, the new Postmaster General, has instituted sweeping changes in the agency, including staffing cuts, crackdowns on overtime pay, and curtailing late trips for mail carriers. These changes have resulted in widespread mail delays, which would make it difficult for people to vote by mail.
The voter can do everything right and not have their ballot counted because of a slow delivery. That's a problem.
The Postal Service is now warning states that there may not be enough time for ballots to be requested, completed, and returned before November 3rd. That is a hoped-for outcome for Trump, who set out to cripple the post office during the pandemic. This is only the latest example of Trump undermining the U.S. institutions.
This, again, is not a debate about the Postal Service alone. That's important. This is about the future of American democracy and whether people have a right to participate.
Furthermore, NBC News has obtained an internal document revealing plans for the post office to remove 671 high-volume mail processing machines from postal facilities across the country. These are the effects of President Trump's campaign to disrupt the election by disenfranchising the voters. Trump has even said he may not accept the results of the presidential election, setting the stage for an epic showdown in November.
Well, this is the other thing that I think Trump is hoping for, is he wants to have an enormous chaos after the election, in which if the election is close, there'll be a lot of pressure. If the mail is having problems, there'll be a lot of pressure on registrars to get court orders saying that they have to count votes that came in even later than that. And then Trump will say, oh, they're cheating. They're taking late votes and counting them. And it'll get tied up in the courts, and we won't have a victor for, a long time. It'll probably go to the Supreme Court.
Trump has been creating chaos and dealing with it in authoritarian ways. During the most recent nationwide protests against racial injustice, Trump deployed armed federal agents to American cities to crush the protests. What will happen if Trump refuses to concede if he lost in November? Democratic leaders in Congress are scrambling to deny the Republican president the chance to secure his re-election by rigging the system. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have called on Postal Service officials to testify before Congress.
I'm demanding that Leader McConnell go into regular session so we can have these hearings, and then Senator Johnson have the hearings, call Mr. DeJoy, call the head of the Postal Commission for them, and ask them why they're doing these things, and see what answers they're getting. And if Mr. DeJoy refuses to appear, he should be stamped return to sender.
Speaker Pelosi also called on the House to return for a special session to vote on legislation that prohibits the Postal Service from implementing any changes to its operations. But Congress and the White House have been deadlocked for weeks in their efforts to hammer out a stimulus package to help struggling Americans affected by the pandemic. An agreement on legislation or even a passage of a relief bill appear to be weeks away. After the discussions collapsed, President Trump signed a series of executive orders to extend some pandemic relief, a move that will face legal challenges because Congress controls federal funding.
Democrats are obstructing all of it. Therefore, I'm taking executive action. We've had it. And we're going to save American jobs and provide relief to the American workers, and I'll be signing these bills in a very short period of time.
The extra funds for the Postal Service are part of the relief bill that Congress and the White House cannot agree on. What does this say about the dysfunction in Washington?
What's deadlocked is the Democrats are saying we need to fix the post office, we need to provide aid to states and municipalities who are having their taxes, the collections for the taxes are slashed enormously, so they don't have the funds to hire all the people that, teachers, fire department, police, and all those people. They don't have the money to pay them, so they're asking for federal help for that. And it's being opposed by the Republicans who control the Senate, and also by Trump. So because they can't reach a compromise, there's no aid at all for the post office. There's no aid for the states. There's no aid for cities.
Despite his efforts to manipulate the election in his favor, Trump's campaign is in a tough spot. The president's polling numbers are sinking because of his erratic handling of the COVID-19 crisis, which has killed over 170,000 people and plunged the U.S. economy. Many Trump voters are having second thoughts about their support for the president.
I'm Kristen Urquiza. I'm one of the many who has lost a loved one to COVID. My dad, Mark Anthony Urquiza, should be here today, but he isn't. He had faith in Donald Trump. He voted for him, listened to him, believed him and his mouthpieces when they said that coronavirus was under control and going to disappear.
Trump's iron-handed response to the nationwide anti-racism protests has also damaged his standing with voters. A recent NBC News Wall Street Journal poll has found that 50% of registered voters favored Democratic nominee Joe Biden, while just 41% said they supported President Trump. Polls also show that Trump is trailing Biden by significant margins in some key battleground states that are likely to define the outcome of the November election. How are America's crises going to play out in the election?
I do think that there's a difference between the current election and the one in 2016, and that is that Hillary Clinton was a profoundly unpopular candidate. Biden doesn't have that problem. He's not an inspiring figure. He's not an electrifying speaker by any means, but he's not hated. And that's a big difference. Trump, on the other hand, after 4 years as president, has turned off a lot of people who voted for him last time.
The Biden campaign has received a boost since the former vice president chose California Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate. New polls suggest that the decision has boded well with voters, especially with minority voters.
This is a moment of real consequence for America. Everything we care about, our economy, our health, our children, the kind of country we live in, it's all on the line. We're reeling from the worst public health crisis in a century. The president's mismanagement of the pandemic has plunged us into the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And we're experiencing a moral reckoning with racism and systemic injustice that has brought a new coalition of conscience to the streets of our country, demanding change.
It's still too early to tell how much Harris will help boost support for the Democratic ticket. African American voters account for a substantial share of the vote in battleground states that Trump narrowly carried in 2016, including Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. This is significant as Trump is losing support of crucial parts of his base, especially among senior white citizens.
A lot of older people, older white people in particular, are concerned because he's attacked Social Security, which is what they depend on. So all in all, I think that it's likely that Democrats are going to win this election.
At a time when Americans give Trump awful marks on race relations, it's hard to see Harris as anything other than a plus for Biden. But so far, Biden and his deputy have largely settled for politics as usual. They have to be a force for change if they want to appeal to an electorate already disgusted by the language of hate and division. But many voters, especially the younger generation, see the Democrats as being just the other side of the same coin. What alternative do the American voters have?
Can anyone tell me why they're removing mailboxes? Like, if they don't actually need them, then why don't they repurpose them, turn them into a trash can or a flower pot or a new apartment for Oscar the Grouch. I mean, maybe he'd be a little less grouchy if his house was filled with postcards instead of bags of dog shit. Now, Trump is claiming that the reason he's going after mail-in votes is that it has too much fraud. But no one has ever been able to find evidence of that claim. So yesterday, Trump's chief of staff said this.
Do you realize how inaccurate the voter rolls are with just people just moving around, not let alone the people that die off, but sending ballots out just based on a voter roll registration? Anytime you move, you'll change your driver's license, but you don't call up and say, hey, by the way, I'm
widespread voter fraud, though. But there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud.
There's no evidence that there's not either. That's the definition of fraud, Jake.
Wow. So there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud, but there's also no evidence that there isn't widespread voter fraud. I mean, once you go into that argument, there's nothing you can't claim anymore.
U.S. worst humiliation. The United States has had its share of humiliating moments at the United Nations Security Council, but all pale in comparison to the humiliation it suffered this month. Only one of the 15 council members, that is, the Dominican Republic, supported a U.S. resolution to have an arms embargo extended against Iran.
برای اولین باره که آمریکایی‌ها در شورای امنیت سازمان ملل قطعنامه‌ای رو پیشنهاد میدن و فقط یک کشور کوچولوی جزیره‌ای به او رأی میده.
The arms embargo is set to be lifted under the 2015 Iran nuclear deal in October. 11 members, including US allies France, Germany and the United Kingdom, abstained from the vote, and two, that is Russia and China, voted against it. They did not even have to brandish a veto. It's hard to remember another vote on which the US was humiliated quite this badly. Iran hailed the Security Council vote, saying the US has never been so isolated.
On this particular resolution, they were extremely isolated, and only the Dominican Republic supported them. And having been to the Dominican Republic and talked to political people there, I can tell you there are going to be a large percentage of the population who are very upset that their government, like our government in Canada, so slavishly follows U.S. foreign policy. So in the end, this is probably one of the most egregious examples of the inglorious isolation and the increasingly inglorious isolation of the USA.
The US knew prior to the vote that the resolution would fail in the Security Council. Russia and China had made it clear that they would veto the measure if necessary. European members were afraid that Iran would simply withdraw from the 2015 nuclear deal if the arms embargo was to be extended in violation of the deal. Why did the United States not try to avoid public humiliation when it already knew the resolution would fail?
U.S. presidents play to two audiences traditionally. One is the foreign audience of its allies and client states and its enemies, and the other audience is the domestic audience. And in this particular instance, Trump may have been playing to the domestic audience primarily because he wants to show his friends in the pro-Israel lobby and in the Christian evangelical movement that he is tough on Iran. He is tough in support of Israel.
Analysts say stopping arms sales to Iran is not Washington's main objective. The goal, rather, is to restore all sanctions on Iran and kill the JCPOA in case a new administration wants to revive it.
Trump may have an ulterior motive here. He may be trying to generate the equivalent of a constitutional crisis within the United Nations organization by trying to trigger the snapback mechanism against Iran, even though he shamefully led the U.S. out of and abrogated the JCPOA and the UN Resolution 2231.
A day after the U.S. suffered the humiliating defeat at the Security Council, President Trump pledged to push an equally unpopular snapback of UN sanctions against Iran.
Just a few minutes ago, I delivered letters to both the UN Secretary General Guterres and to the President of the Security Council. I notified them that the United States is initiating the restoration of virtually all UN sanctions on Iran lifted under UN Security Council Resolution 2231. This process will lead to those sanctions coming back into effect 30 days from today.
The snapback was granted to the signatories of the nuclear agreement in the event of a violation of the terms by Iran. The European Union says since the US unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, it cannot be considered a part of it. Iran says the snapback is illegal.
snapback آمریکا اونچنان غیر قانونیه که قابل پذیرش نیست و آمریکایی‌ها اینو میدونن. خیال نکنین اگر یک حرفی رو بلند زدند و تکرار کردند حق دارند. آمریکا میداند نمیتواند اسنپبک بکنه.
The same overwhelming majority of Security Council members who opposed the arms ban extension also opposed the snapback. Is the United States in for another humiliation?
The U.S. is showing extreme pride or hubris here, thinking that it can activate this trigger mechanism to have the snapback against Iran over and have an extension of the arms embargo. Well, that's not going to happen. And so the U.S. will indeed suffer a further humiliation on this particular subject.
The United States will try to use whatever leverage it has to pressure other countries into taking economic measures against Iran. That will create even more resentment in the international community towards Washington. Observers fear President Trump might take more drastic measures, such as withdrawing from the United Nations or provoking a military confrontation with Iran.
He may be trying to throw the United Nations into disarray for his own political purposes. He may use this as the failure of the UN to go along with his ridiculous proposition that he be able to use the snapback mechanism, even though the U.S. withdrew from the treaty, to withdraw funding from the UN, and that has happened before with the USA. And under Trump, he has withdrawn funding from the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN. Or he may, in fact, have in the back of his mind to withdraw the U.S. entirely from the United Nations.
Almost all UN sanctions resolutions have been adopted in support of American foreign policy objectives. The US has waged economic terrorism to bring countries like Iran, North Korea, Libya and Lebanon into submission. The policy has often been a failure for the United States.
So sanctions will have an economic impact, but they will not change policy. The United States must learn that. US has an addiction to sanctions, and they believe that these sanctions are a panacea that resolve all the problems. They don't. They, in fact, hurt people.
Following the latest Security Council rebuke, the US will find it increasingly difficult to force the rest of the international community to go along with its sanctions policy.
Around the world, there is a growing movement around the fact that sanctions kill, and people are growing increasingly angry with these coercive economic measures.
The US has alienated many of its traditional allies. The transatlantic alliance, for example, has taken a turn for the worse, thanks to Trump's unilateralism and America First agenda. Europe actively seeks greater diplomatic and security autonomy from the United States. President Trump is trying to bring Europe back into capitulation through economic sanctions and tariffs.
When the hegemon, when the U.S. imperial power starts applying these coercive economic measures against its friends and traditional allies, then they are not going to get support in the future.
The U.S. is beset by growing crises at home, confounded by the Trump administration's erratic handling of the coronavirus, as well as race relations in the country. Is the world witnessing an America in decline?
That the United States is cutting itself off from its political friends and its trading partners. So the result is a general decline in the power and influence of the United States. So yes, the United States seems to be an empire on its way out, while China and Russia, Iran, and other countries around the world seem to be rising and gaining the recognition and trust of other countries.